Welcome back. It's another episode of Decline and Fall. I am coming to you from an undisclosed location as I seek to avoid Keir Starmer's press gangs, which roam the streets looking for anybody who looks as slightly suspicious and is over the age of 40. I unfortunately meet the bill on both counts. So I am coming to you from a disused Ministry of Defence bunker in the English Midlands somewhere, and joining me from Tito's personal bunker in an undisclosed location in Vojvodina. It's Kit Turnberg.
Hey Alex, how's it going? Yeah,
Uh,
I actually I credit myself with amazing foresight because I saw this conscription coming,
hmm.
and I fled Britain more than 5 years ago now. I feel much safer here. So yeah, but yes, no, I think we've got a hell of a show today. Yeah, there are weeks when decades happen and decades when weeks happen,
Hmm.
and I think we're in the former category now. Really, we're kind of getting into the end zone, blunderingly so, on Ukraine.
Hmm.
Take it away, Alex. Where are
Well,
we?
here we are. There has been a conversation, in the words, or a call, in the words of Donald Trump, between him and President Putin, where essentially, from what I've read of the transcripts so far, it seems that Trump kept saying we need a ceasefire, and we don't, and I don't want Iran to destroy Israel, and Putin kept saying that's very nice, but you need to cut off like military and intelligence sharing with the Kiev regime, and without that, there can be no ceasefire. And just to prove a point, the Kiev regime launched another absolutely futile attack on the Belgorod region just yesterday. I'm sure we will get into this, but I think it's what you would refer to as a racing certainty that that's the British plan again, just to make the point that the war will not be allowed to end. And this is why, of course, Zelensky is going back and forth, depending upon the last person he spoke to, saying wildly contradictory things, which leads us to the first item on our agenda for today, I think, which is that the so-called red lines that the Kiev regime has seem to change almost by the hour due to the fact that Zelensky and co. Essentially are being tossed from pillar to post at the moment. But what's your take on the latest in the so-called negotiations and the bartering?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that the number one, yes, the call which was being hailed as like this new Yalta moment. I think it was as overrated as Yalta itself in terms of
Mm.
its actual significance. There was the idea that I mean Iran and Russia, who are conjoined at the hip, economically, militarily, and politically at this point, that Russia is just going to throw Iran under the bus in return for a ceasefire when, yes, they are winning. They are advancing everywhere. They are crushing what remains of the Ukrainians the Ukrainian forces in Kursk and have them surrounded. It's yeah, it's all quite bizarre. But out of this kind of chaos, the Independent reported, and this got very little traction, although I think it's substantive change in Zelensky's position, which is very interesting. Is following the fallout of the I believe it was February 28th Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Vance and Trump, which ended very, very, very badly. Zelensky, defiant, said, "Well, we will accept no territorial concessions whatsoever to Russia. Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government will never recognize the Donbass and or Zaporozhye or these other regions, which are now, according to Russia's constitution, Russian territory, as anything but Ukrainian." Now he's rowed back on that significantly now, and his according to his new red lines, he will not accept any further
Mm.
territorial concessions. Please, pretty please.
Mm.
And this is again while Russia is advancing on all fronts with very little in the way of resistance. So, I mean, again, fantastical, but I think at the same time it represents a kind of a cold hard dose of reality has been injected into or snorted
Mm.
by the cokehead of Kiev, because yeah, the idea that they're going to regain what's been lost. I mean, particularly Crimea, which the British have been encouraging them to go for with all sorts of crazed operations like the attack on Krinky, and the pointless strikes on Kerch Bridge, which they seem particularly obsessed with. It reflects a reality, and it shows that his position is softening and changing. And I think that is a reflection of the fact that he knows that for all of the tweeting from European leaders, and the firm statements of support, and all of the talk of deploying European forces to Ukraine, which we'll get into. Actually, they remain completely dependent on the US, and the US's position is, and this was the position of the Biden administration as well, is they're not going to get back what they've lost, and
Yes.
they need to get serious about this and just accept it. So that's a small but significant development, and I think it could well be the start of his red lines could be pulled back further, as the reality on the ground changes.
Well, I think it's significant that he essentially admitted Zelensky in a press conference, I believe, just yesterday, that without the US, essentially he's fucked, because the Europeans, for all of the blather, as you indicate, and all of these conferences and all of these war games, which quite literally are, which might as well be a game of Warhammer 40K played by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, for all the realism that this has. Without the US,
Mm.
there is nothing that the Kiev regime can do. If you read into the statements by Macron and Starmer, it's all hedged and heavily around the idea of we will send troops in if there is a ceasefire, and then it's like, well, if he's asked about it, he'll say, well, but we don't want a direct war with the Russians, which they don't because they would lose. And so, and then Macron talks about like we'd have forces in there by what, 2035, so a decade away. So, like we'd be ready to deploy by 2035. So it's all the same game that they've been playing all the way along. And like my my only conclusion that I can draw from this is that this is more about bolstering Zelensky and his regime, or the Maidan regime that exists in Kiev, and making sure that Ukrainians keep fighting on the promise that, sure, lads, the British and the French are coming to do Crimean War Part Two any day now. Maybe they'll bring, maybe they'll bring the forces of Savoy with them or something, if we're going retro. And they'll be marching on Sevastopol any day now. So keep going, lads. That's the point. And so my interpretation of this is this is all a cynical game by principally London and Paris now, to make sure that the war continues in the same way for as long as possible. But what's your interpretation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do think that the thing is I genuinely do believe that Starmer and Macron are serious about deploying forces to Ukraine. The problem is they're not serious people.
Hmm.
So, I mean, we saw that recently. We've seen a flurry of press photos of Starmer in military jackets while still wearing his suit trousers,
Hmm.
and there are all sorts of photo ops like that, and as we previously discussed, all these British magazine and newspaper front covers talking Starmer up as the second incarnation of Churchill, or the third after Thatcher.
Hmm.
And there does seem to be an aspect of fake it till you make it.
Hmm.
Right. So the British and the French are talking in terms of a deployment being plausible, of it being inevitable, and just a matter of, well, when Zelensky asks us, we're gonna be there. They are trying to they are trying to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, without any consideration of the reality that they actually can't do this, and their military chiefs will tell them not to do it because
Mm.
they'll get slaughtered.
Yes.
But that's in the short term. I mean, and I think in the long term, they are very much committed to, yes, as you say, keeping this going and deploying forces there in some capacity. Although, I mean, whether Ukraine will consist purely of Kiev by that point, and that will be Zelensky's red line, by the time they actually get there, is an open question. Yeah, I think this also speaks to the fact that as we have seen on so many issues, when there's a lot of sound and fury from European countries on, say, frozen Russian assets or military and financial support to Ukraine, or the deployment of soldiers, if not jets, to Ukraine. Once those bombastic declarations have been made, then suddenly that you hit the problem that they can't agree on anything.
Mm.
And I mean, we've on the subject of keeping this going. Recently there was talk of just stripping Hungary's voting rights in the European in the European Parliament and Commission to prevent them getting in the way.
Mm.
As if this is going to solve anything, and then this is the one barrier to holding us back. It's conjuring nothing from thin air, and I mean, on the long term point, something that caught my eye was a report in one of the world's worst newspapers, the Daily Express, which effectively stated that Liz Kendall, if you remember who she is, she's the work and pension secretary, for the benefit of our non-perfidious Albion viewers. She said that young people will be pushed to join the army to cut youth unemployment. Now, when there was a reports about a couple of months ago about how layoffs at British firms were at kind of financial crisis levels. My immediate thought was, well, these people are probably going to be pushed into joining the military, and
Mm.
this has now been confirmed. But again, as we have discussed ad infinitum on past shows, if you are going for what effectively amounts to conscription via the back door, or conscription in everything but name, you hit the problem that it means that a lot of working class people are going to be trained to use weapons. And that is something the British elite is never going to allow, or
Mhm.
is only going to allow in a very restricted manner, because there is the threat that it will rebound on them horribly. And this is on top of the fact that there is, for all of Starmer's pomp and affected swagger, which comes across as someone who's just defecated in their pants, and is like desperately trying to hide it from the outside world. Yeah, like there is no support for this. There is, if you look at polls, it is in the low double digits, the number of British people who said that they would fight and die for their country. Starmer's personal approval ratings are in the toilet. There's been zero uptick whatsoever in his polling, or his government's polling. So I mean, it's not a plausible proposition. And yes, that there is a huge scope for blowback if they go ahead with this.
Well, yes, and the other point, as we have stated before, is that they're so phenomenally disorganized, and the system's so utterly corroded that they can't even cope with the number of recruits, which isn't high, that they're getting at the moment. So, for
Mm.
instance, there is this story from the just last year, which is that the fact that they've outsourced the application process to Serco actually meant that the British Army kept missing its recruitment targets because the system's so phenomenally inefficient, which pretty much sums up like modern Britain, really, which is that essentially like the British government just acts as a distributor of funds to very corrupt and very inept corporations who produce nothing but absorb a large budget. And that's true for everything involving the army as well. So,
Mm.
and this is like the a classic case of like late stage imperial parasitism, which is that the parasitic corporations cannibalize even the bits of the state that the state needs to actually carry out its repressive and exploitative activities. So they got themselves in a very deep hole. And I don't think that the likes of Keir Starmer is going to be able to get them out of it, nor is like Nigel Farage, who might be in with a sniff of power soon. But more on him in future episodes, I think, because his career is a rather interesting one, which we should come back to, and his rather interesting relationship with certain intelligence services probably needs to be explored. But to go
Mm.
back to this, like, are they going to be able to overcome this? Keir Starmer, being an idiot, or basically like having Mark from Peep Show as Prime Minister, is the kind of idiot who actually thinks that if he signs something, it means it's real. That I think he's
Yes.
convinced of that. Whereas the generals might be reactionaries, and indeed they are, might be bloodthirsty madmen, but they at least they seem to realize that the Starmer is waving an empty gun. Basically, there is no army that can go and fight Russia. Not now, not tomorrow, not even in 5 years. And
Mm.
if they do conscription, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be essentially dropping a giant rock into a pond and stirring everything up, which is what they've consciously avoided doing for like over 60 years now. Which is that the British Empire continues to exist in its neo-colonial form as long as and can sustain itself as long as there is never the chance of significant military casualties being inflicted upon British forces. That's the way they've operated. That's the why they're, as you've covered extensively in your reporting, British imperialism is based on outsourcing, offshoring, and like relatively small numbers of British personnel running much larger proxy armies and running proxy wars in all kinds of places, particularly now Ukraine. And if you try and switch to a system where you're going to do mass recruitment of poor, downtrodden, working class young men, shove them in uniform and send them off to what? Die in vast numbers in Belgorod? What you're going to get back home is all kinds of social explosions. So I don't think they'll do it unless they're absolutely desperate. But then again, we are getting to the point where if this Ukraine thing finally goes kaput, they're going to get desperate. So we might be reaching a point where they're faced with a choice of either like going in one direction and facing chronic destabilization, or going in another, or staying as they are and facing just defeat and disaster. And then that'll be the choice that the ruling class has to make. But what's your analysis of that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do think that I mean, completely agree, and I think that yes, that it must be remembered that both world wars greatly galvanized the British working class. I mean, Britain was on the verge of, arguably on the verge of a revolution similar to what upturned the Russian Empire in 1917. You have all these battle-hardened, embittered, and uh, uh, soldiers returning from battlefields who have seen the enormous, exorbitant sums spent on war, who want something back for their investment and the risks they took, but also are asking the very obvious question of, well, if we can spend all of this money killing Germans and killing ourselves, surely we can invest it in schools and hospitals and all sorts of other slightly less belligerent assets. But I think that the details of that story that you just had on that we just had on the screen are really worth digging into, because yes, as you say, this is kind of late stage capitalism writ absolutely large. The figures involved in this are completely insane. So from 2014 to 2024, there was an application, over 700,000 people applied to join the army. Um, Almost 600,000 of them withdrew their applications because they were waiting for 6 months for Serco to process them. Like it's like fewer than 1 in 10 of the 137,000 people who were employed to join the Army, Navy, and RAF in 2023 alone actually ended up serving. And over half of them just gave up on the process altogether because, yeah, in the spirit of these things, because the private sector is always more efficient than the public sector. They've privatized themselves into disarmament,
Hmm.
and disillusionment, mass disillusionment with with the system. And I might add that this story is based on figures provided by John Healey, who was then the shadow defense secretary. But since taking office, Labour has done absolutely nothing to try and reverse this, apart from, as we've just discussed, trying to force jobless young people, of which there are many,
Hmm.
into the military. But then, if that does happen, they're just going to be stuck in a queue.
Hmm.
A very British failure, but yeah, I mean, it's just again, the disconnect between rhetoric and reality, as we've discussed. I mean, it's amusing, but it's also quite worrying because. As much as Britain has been reduced, rather pathetically reduced to this yapping chihuahua on the world stage without the muscle or the wealth to seriously consider being anything like a global power with any sense of proper force projection, they are still able to stir up trouble. As I'm sure we'll get into in due course, but it's like, yeah, so that they're still able to trigger proxy conflicts or like attempt to carry out coups or flare up tensions around the world due to their outsized the outsized influence of their security and intelligence services. But it will, if it actually does come to all out conflict, at most it will be other people doing the fighting and dying for them. Of course,
Hmm.
this was the entire purpose of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, as spelled out by George Soros openly in the early 90s when he wrote an essay, which you can find on his website, which is amazingly candid, where he talks about how well NATO expansion into Eastern Europe will reduce the risk of body bags coming home
Hmm.
to Western capitals, which is the key inhibitor on Western states acting militarily overseas. But the fact of the matter is that if in the event that they manage to overcome issues around recruitment and indeed also administrative hell of actually enlisting these people, body bags are going to be coming back in quite some profusion.
Hmm.
Because I mean, as even the mainstream media has been forced to admit, Ukrainian cemeteries have had to be vastly expanded in size. You can very easily find footage online of the vast number of flags billowing from the graves of people who were, yes, in most cases aggressively bundled into conscription vans, sent to the front with very little training, and then killed often or almost immediately. There was recently a story of a young British lad who went to Ukraine age 17. The second he was 18, he was sent to the front, and it was literally, I think it was within a few
In
minutes
a few
he was
minutes,
killed.
killed by
Yeah,
Russian drones.
he was killed by Russian drones, and it's like, well, I mean, so there's going to be a lot of that, and I think that another key aspect here that the European powers are seemingly deaf to, whether willfully or out of just pure delusion, is Russian officials have stated unambiguously over and over and over again that if if NATO, sorry, if soldiers from NATO countries are deployed to Ukraine, they will be seen as enemy combatants and treated as such, which is to say, killed.
Hmm.
And the powers that sent them will be seen as belligerents in this war. Yeah, it's a complete and utter fantasy, which nonetheless Starmer et al. Appear utterly committed to fulfilling.
Well, the other element of this, which gives away the game that they're not remotely serious about getting their own forces involved in a shooting war with the Russians, I don't think, is the fact that all the talk of rearmament focuses on not upscaling production domestically, but by sending it either to India, South Korea, or Japan, as this story
Yes.
from the Financial Times shows. So, what exactly is what plan is it that's so great from the Europeans and the British here that their plan is that we're going to send all the work to South Korea? I don't know if they've noticed, but Russia's generally quite close to South Korea. And then you've got free Korea, real Korea, just over the border as well, which the Russians have a very strong military alliance with. So what's the plan here? Build all this thousands of miles away, ship it or all of halfway around the world, deploy it in Europe, and hope that the Russians don't use a submarine to sink the fucking things on the way there. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever, except from the point of view of like trying to maintain the current business model, which is that you don't produce it in country, you produce it outside for the purposes of making more profit from hyper exploiting like South Korean labor. It's no wonder they're not having any children these days. And then ship it back so it can look impressive, or ship it to your proxy force in the east of Europe, which there is of which the Ukrainians have been this version. But I mean, the reason why they barred Calin Georgescu and others from standing in Romania is it's pretty clear that the Europeans, specifically the French and possibly the Germans, have in mind for the Romanians the same fate. Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, though I think the Poles will resist that fate a little bit more, are all clearly viewed as completely disposable entities because that's how the post-socialist regimes there have essentially presented themselves or served up their countries on a plate to the US and the EU over the last 30 years. And so the Europeans are thinking, well, we'll get country X to do it. We'll arm them and have them do it. We'll hurl them at the Russians next, and eventually we might win. A deluded and bloodthirsty and cowardly method of war. But what's your response to this apparent strategy, Kit?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that history is repeating itself with ever growing rapidity
Hmm.
at this stage. So viewers will be forgiven for having forgotten or simply not having noticed that a few weeks back, when there was all of this talk about European rearmament and Ursula von der Leyen talking about investing, was it 800 billion or some
Yeah.
crazy figure in getting Europe a battle ready. European defence stocks surged, and this was all over the British media, in particular the Financial Times, and then precipitously, the within days, if not hours, their share prices collapsed because the heads of these companies said, "Well, it's going to take us a very, very, very long time, as in years, to
Hmm.
be able to fulfill these orders." And then the same thing has played out here, where with some fanfare, the FT reports Asian defense stocks soar to record highs as Europe prepares to rearm. And then when you actually get into the detail of the story, it states Japan's defense companies make up less than 1% of global arms exports, lack commercial experience after the nation's post-war pacifist constitution left them outside military procurement processes for decades. So it's like, oh yeah, well yeah, we're going to get Asia to do this, and then it's like, oh actually they can't.
Hmm.
So and
Yeah.
and and again, it is a demonstration of how GDP and all of these economic figures on paper are actually completely meaningless. And
Yeah.
it's like Yeah, when Russia wants to pay for something or indeed build millions of artillery shells, they dig in their own soil.
Hmm.
Whereas European, Western countries, due to outsourcing, offshoring, and hollowing out their own industrial bases deliberately,
Hmm.
ever since the 1970s, if not before, they have to scour around the world to try and find someone who will attempt to build this for them. And then, in many cases, these countries don't actually have the real resources to do it.
Hmm.
And it's quite remarkable the corner that they have painted themselves into as a result of this genius strategy of deindustrializing themselves. It is a quite some boomerang effect, and I think that I mean, this is something that I wrote about for my website. Shameless plug, but yeah, one of the supposed benefits of being part of this of aiding and abetting the ascension of the unipolar world, which is well and truly destroyed at this point from the early 90s onwards. That was that Western European countries could they could allow their economies to effectively to rot. They could allow their armies to rot because, hey, we have America's security umbrella in perpetuity, and yes, we have all of these new NATO members who'll do the fighting and dying for us if we're attacked. And then actually, when it comes to it, none of this is real.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like it, and it mustn't be forgotten either that there have been numerous attempts since because of the US inability to produce artillery shells and other ammunition and military equipment on any scale. There have been numerous attempts since the very start of the proxy war to kind of scour the world's stockpiles in order to arm Ukraine. It's in all of these initiatives have ended in failure and have been massively corrupt. The Czech Republic was the talk of the town for launching a publicly crowd-funded effort to source artillery shells from around the world. Most of the shells that they managed to rustle up didn't actually work.
Hmm.
It was found that the people running it had been lining their own pockets with donations. Shock horror.
Hmm.
We are seeing the very dangerous divergence between propaganda and reality on a daily basis, but it doesn't seem to be getting through to people
Hmm.
at the highest levels.
Well, I think that the people at the highest level are insulated from the truth by layers and layers of bureaucracy, which need the job of the man at the top, whether it's Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron, is to portray the image that the ruling class would like the rest of the world and the domestic population to believe, which is Britain strong, resolute, incredible naval forces, RAF in the skies defending us like 1940 all over again. In reality, you've got a squalid mess and a deeply corrupt military establishment which is incapable of fielding much of an armed force at all. And if the Russians sent about 15 guys, they could probably take London in about half an hour. And in my view, they're absolutely welcome to it. It's a terrible place. The point being that the salesman is never supposed to believe the things he says. Unfortunately, now you have a two generations, three generations of entirely faith-based politicians who believe that if they say it, it becomes true. And so, as a consequence of this, you have things like Keir Starmer starting his war games session in London with like various other European collaborators, where they are apparently getting 27 nations to join what Starmer has called the operational phase of planning for the deployment to Ukraine. Now, given everything that we've just told you about, dear viewer or listener, do you really think that this is a serious endeavor? Because their production upscaling can't take place for years, whether it's done in country or outsourced, more likely outsourced. They can't process even the volunteers they've got for the army in Britain now, due to a deeply corrupt and deeply useless recruitment process. They can't field an army. They can't field much of a tank force. That is the British. Maybe the French can do slightly better. And they can't even get their troops into Ukraine because they lack the troop transportation methods to take them in there without the Americans doing it for them. And yet they're going to have a war game in London with apparently 27 countries, and they're in the operational phase of planning. So this is faith-based stuff. This is completely delusional. As I said, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron might as well be playing Warhammer 40,000, with with arguing over who gets to be the different Space Marine chapters, because this is about as realistic as this. So like this is the triumph of this is a fronting up operation to try and convince the Russians that they mean business. But the Russians, if you and I can find out all of this stuff about the British Armed Forces being inept and run by deeply corrupt officials, the Russians know all this, the Chinese know all this. So why on earth would they take Sir Keir and his friends seriously, Kit?
Yeah. Well, no, indeed, indeed. And I think, I mean, on the subject of of propaganda versus reality, is that for a very very long time, Britain has prioritized, no doubt, because of issues with recruitment and more generally the collapse of its armed forces, as any serious kind of military force, that they have focused on heavily and invested heavily in psychological warfare, right? So I mean, you can find Ministry of Defense reports from the early 2010s in which they talk about how psychological warfare is the most important form of warfare because we can convince people that we've won, even if we can't win the physical contest. So we can win in people's minds, which is a great strategy until you get nuked. And I think that yes, that this has had a deluding effect on people in positions of power. The Daily Telegraph, for instance, has run a series of quote unquote documentaries, or 10-minute videos on how well Ukraine can win by memes being posted on social media and Zelensky taking selfies at a petrol station, right? And so it's like, and so yeah, I strongly suspect that they think in London and Brussels and Washington that, well, if we announce this major wargaming exercise in London, that in itself is highly significant, and it will probably spook the Russians because it will show that we're really serious about it. But then, I mean, bearing in mind that the last emergency summit in London on how to deal with US withdrawal from Europe, concluded that, well, we need to remain arm in arm with the US. I mean, like we discussed on last week's show, there was that idiot from Chatham House, Timothy Ash, who, in a Bloomberg interview, within a span of a few minutes, went from saying, "Well, we can't rely on the Americans anymore, and NATO is dead," and his prescription for dealing with this was, "Well, we need to rely on the Americans for arms procurement." So yeah, it sounds very grand, and I'm sure that there are sectors, I mean, or ever reducing sectors of the domestic populations of European countries who see this as highly significant. But much like, as we discussed, we will fight them on the spreadsheets. The Keir Starmer's grand announcement of a 0.5 percentage point increase in defence spending by 2027. I can't imagine that these grand meetings are going to result in anything tangible at all. And again, such as the speed with which events move. The media a couple of weeks ago was agog with this notion, with this Sky Shield plan, where Western fighter jets would be deployed to Western Ukraine to defend Ukrainian forces there, but also shoot down Russian missiles. And this got glowing write-ups in various different media outlets, and then was promptly forgotten about because it was just complete insanity.
Hmm.
because it was predicated on this notion that well, Russia can't and won't escalate.
Well,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, they not only can they, but they have on numerous occasions escalated. It's the delusion of the think tank crowd in London and Washington is that, oh well, just because Russia hasn't literally sent an Oreshnik to, I don't know, blow up the Eiffel Tower yet, or or to take out the Ministry of Defense in London, that somehow they haven't escalated. They've killed quite a lot of NATO personnel now. I mean, they
Mm,
killed a whole bunch of them on the first day of the SMO when they blew up like that barracks in Lvov. They've
mm,
killed a lot of French instructors. I mean, the British are very tight-lipped about the number of British officers who have died there, but my guess is it's quite significant. Suddenly, there's a lot of British officers in Germany who've died in mysterious car crashes that, or in the words of Blackadder, very sadly, brutally cut his own head off whilst combing his hair.
yes.
But the idea is, oh well, the Russians just won't hit back, but they have. It's just that it's not been talked about. It's like
Mm,
the Russians blew up like the British's famed sea drone squadrons in Odessa. I mean, you and I talked about this a while ago. And what they did was they carefully lured them out into the open, just waited for Grant Shapps to show up, pinned some medals of them, allowed old Grant to leave, and then blew them up afterwards. So this is there have been escalations. It's that what's generally happened though is that these have been not acknowledged by the people in the West, who keep going back to this idea that they can find a one weird trick to win the war. I mean, it's whether it's the Kursk incursion, whether it's the Krinky operation, whether it's another incursion into Belgorod, it all just comes down to this idea that they can psyop the Russians out of existence. Now, I would say that their delusion here is not quite completely divorced from reality because there is an element of truth in the British psyop games and American psyop games did work to an extent in the Cold War, which is that the a part of the Psy War operations on the Soviet Union was to exploit splits in the Soviet leadership and to encourage the growth of anti-socialist elements within the Soviet leadership. And this was done through the recruitment of direct traitors, but also by constantly emphasizing that the British and the Americans were streets ahead of the Soviet Union technologically speaking, that their economies were far stronger, etc., etc. This was mostly bullshit, given that
mm,
the great economic growth of the post-war period only lasted 20 years, and it was nothing like what was sold into the USSR as this model. But it did convince a certain amount of the leadership of the USSR that they couldn't hope to ever compete with the imperialists. Wasn't true. That was the thing. It was an illusion, and unfortunately, a lot of people in the east of Europe fell for the illusion. And then when they got the reality of it, which is that, oh, by the way, you are now cheap labor for German companies, and your industrial base has been destroyed. And essentially, would you go mind going and finishing off the Russians for us? That's a good chap. So the Psy War has worked for the Brits in the past, but, and here's the point, it's never been as far removed from actual economic power as it is now. The Psy War in the 40s and the 50s could work because Britain still had like a substantial industrial, scientific, and technological base. It doesn't have that anymore. It's just got literally like the ideological and Psy War elements in their intelligence apparatus and cultural machinery. And due to the fact that, to throw in a Stalin line, consciousness lags behind material reality. Material reality is that the British economy is like basically a fraud scheme, a Ponzi scheme that keeps on running. Whereas like British cultural power, British psychological operations still are running on the fumes of the past. And the men who run them are still convinced that they've still got something, whereas in reality, what they've got is the final elements of like the fumes from the previous British power still existing. So this is where things stand in Britain. It's a little bit less bad in the United States, but they're not too far away from it themselves because they're rapidly hurtling towards end stage imperialism themselves. Some of them want to try and change their trajectory. I don't think they will succeed, though. But did you want to add anything more to that particular section of discussion?
Well, sure. I mean, I do think there's an interesting historical parallel there as well, with I mean, like with the present, where um, I mean, we are constantly being told relentlessly that, oh, like, well, China can't innovate, which is completely ludicrous. Like, I mean, if you actually look at like the published scientific papers and patents, China is outstripping the entirety of Europe by some margin collectively.
Mm,
It is well ahead of the US in most fields, and
mm,
it's like so much of the investment of the military industrial complex is in things that don't work because particular elements of the power structure, or indeed just individuals like Elon Musk, have a particular obsession with a specific field, and we're told it's very important, and we're told that America has an edge in it. And as an example, um, the Trump administration, it's not gotten that much in the way of media coverage, but I mean I've written about this for Mint Press. Trump is surrounded by people who are all in on AI. And at a press conference not long after taking office, he announced, I think it was on the second day in January, after his swearing in, he announced this 500 billion AI initiative called Stargate, and at this press conference he was surrounded by all of these very shady figures linked to the Pentagon and the CIA who are all in on AI, and then along comes China with DeepSeek,
mm,
which rivals, if not outright eclipses, the capabilities of all current Western industry leaders at a negligible fraction of the cost. And it's like, well, this alleged edge in so many fields that the West, mainly the US, claims to have. It's in spheres that have zero benefit to the public whatsoever,
mm,
and are unlikely to actually work when it comes down to it. Another upshot of the unipolar world is that I mean, we're heading to the 26th anniversary on Sunday of NATO's criminal bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. The upshot of that campaign was that because it was allegedly a war won using air power alone, enormous amounts of money were invested by the Pentagon and in air power, and then in turn, all of the US allies, close allies, bought at exorbitant expense all of these fighter jets like the F-35 that like don't work. I mean, the F-35 has cost the US something like $1 trillion to develop, and it
mm.
doesn't. It keeps on failing tests. They are very unreliable. They need to be constantly serviced. And yeah, they and but most importantly, they're really crap at winning wars.
Mm.
You cannot win a war with air power alone. And the alleged success of the bombing of Yugoslavia was based on consciously falsified data by the US Air Force, which wanted the lion's share of the Pentagon's investment.
Mm.
And so, yeah, the US and all of its allies have invested massively well, call it technology or resources that don't actually work, and they're now lumbered with it.
Mm.
So I think that it's in yes, in the stuff like Star Wars in the 1980s, when the Reagan administration got obsessed with the idea of space lasers and got all these sci-fi writers in to advise them on how to make space lasers.
Mm.
The Soviet leadership at the time was successfully manipulated or coerced into investing enormous amounts of time and energy in those fields, because they felt that, well, we need to keep up with the Americans, and it contributed significantly to their economic decline, like chasing this white elephant of space power. the Chinese and the Russians are not taking the bait this time, and the Russians invest heavily in weapon systems that just work.
Hmm.
And we're seeing on the fields of Donbass, but also Kursk, all of this exorbitantly priced Western military equipment, which has been, either abandoned or destroyed, and hasn't really had much in the way of any tangible impact on the battlefield reality from Ukraine's perspective. The F-16s, which were given to, which we were told were a game changer after many prior game changers failed to achieve much of anything. They were given to Ukraine I believe it was the start of last year with much fanfare. Do we hear anything about them now? No.
I've still got the Paul Mason tweet about this saved somewhere, which is where he just said he just tweeted F-16s, 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 F-16s over and over again, presumably whilst in the middle of some kind of sort of spice-induced frenzy.
Induced.
Yeah.
Yeah, sat in a fountain, tweeting.
Yeah, sat in a
But
fountain with no trousers on, tweeting furiously at 2 in the morning. That's the kind.
yeah.
That's the spice diet. That's why he looks like you
Yeah,
know.
he seems to have lost an enormous amount of weight. I mean, I think there's probably a portrait of him in an attic somewhere that's getting fatter. But
Hmm.
yes, it is all it is the I think we're witnessing the end point of self-delusion, which is actually, it's shattering upon contact with reality.
Well, yes, exactly. And like just to round off this segment with a final story that even the BBC had to admit to that the stress testing of the MOD's capacities in so-called war games, and this is again from the end of last year, that they would basically the British Army would run out of ammunition in a very, very short period of time if they were to go up against the Russians, which again why would anybody be surprised about this, given that the wars that the British Army has been involved in for the last 30 odd years have been in either short, sharp ones or like long-term occupations of places like Afghanistan, which have faced
Mm,
like low intensity insurgencies, which by the way they still lost in the end.
yeah.
And so why would you be surprised that you would get literally like outproduced by the Russians in a record amount of time? You'd run out of ammunition and then you'd run out of men. And again, like, right, is Keir Starmer or is anybody in the British political establishment prepared to do anything about this? No, no, I don't think so. They're going to make announcements. They're going to make really big they're going to hold really big sounding conferences. They're going to have joint press conferences with Emmanuel Macron and I don't know Friedrich Merz or whoever, and basically nothing's going to get done because the bottom line is that nothing should get in the way of business as usual. And business as usual for the British ruling class is being as parasitic as possible and making sure just that the flow of money out of state coffers into private bank accounts continues, and the public are treated to a merry dance to distract them. But this is the grim reality, which is again the illusions. The desperation of the British ruling class is to continue with the illusions over and above everything else, because once the illusions go, then there's not much left, basically.
Indeed, indeed, and I think as well that it's what's interesting is that I think that Britain's obsessional focus with finance as their sole source of wealth, again on paper. This is why they were all in on the Russian sanctions, because they don't actually understand how economies that aren't completely dependent on the financial services actually operate.
Hmm.
And I mean, you've got on screen here a reference to this 2021 war game,
Hmm.
where this is an absolutely money quote. the entire British Army's inventory was exhausted with every bit of important ammunition expended before the 10-day exercise was completed. We have talked before about how there was a little notice, July, I believe it was July 2024, the House of Lords Defence Committee published this report based on extensive consultation with defence industry apparatchiks, think tankers, and British military veterans. Over and over again, they said, we don't have the equipment to sustain anything like a protracted conflict. And what Ukraine shows us is the proxy war in Ukraine shows us is that you run out of things very quickly. What's their prescription? Print more money.
Hmm.
Like
Yes.
and try and convince the public of the need to pay for things. Well, again, as we have discussed ad infinitum, the like the sums on paper mean absolutely nothing when you don't have the resources or the industry to back it. Keir Starmer could pledge trillions weekly
Mm.
to Ukraine. It doesn't mean anything though.
No.
Um, Sorry, go
Ba
ahead.
Basically, what he's doing is, again, like this is a case of like manipulations. You convince Ukraine that Britain is something that it is not, which is that it can produce the war material needed for Ukraine, which it cannot do. The French barely that much better. The Germans, it'll take years for institutions like Rheinmetall to catch up with where they need to be. Merz probably knows that, which is why like they're making a lot of noise, but again, nothing, very little will follow it up. The question then is, like, if things go the way in which I suspect they will, which is that the Russians will be forced to finish the Kiev regime off on the battlefield rather than get any kind of deal out of this, like, well, what happens then? Which is the interesting question. I mean, I imagine by that time that happens, Keir Starmer and will be a political obituary that no one will remember. But what are the people who actually run Britain do then? Is the question. Do they make some mad, reckless gamble, or do they do the thing that I think that they will do, which is try and conduct some cynical deal to get them out of the mess? Either way, the future is not particularly pretty for those of us who actually live in old perfidious Albion, and it's probably why many are taking the exit door as quickly as possible before the ship finally sinks. So, shall we move to our next section now, Kit? Eh,
Yeah,
which is,
absolutely.
of course, we are moving to, shall we say, a place closer to where you are. I wanted to cover this week, which is the Serbian story. So we've
Sure.
seen all kinds of things in the Western press this last week about the giant protests against against Vucic and his government, who is described as pro-Russian, but I think the reality is not quite that by quite some distance. I think the Serbian population is probably much more pro-Russian than any of their leaders are. However, there are these vast protests against the Vucic government. So I wanted to ask you, as somebody who's, of course, resident in the region, what is the actual reality of these? Are these, US, EU sponsored maneuvers, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the protests, the kind of spark which ignited these protests was that in at the start of November last year, there was a horrific tragedy where a section of a train station in Novi Sad, which is this very beautiful city in the north of Serbia, and is regarded as the Serbia's second city after Belgrade. It collapsed and it killed a number of people, including several children. There was initially a huge amount of speculation, which was complete and utter rubbish, that this was the result of dodgy Chinese infrastructure project. This is completely untrue. It was a freak accident because. That occurred because that section of the station hadn't been renovated. So subsequent to this, students, it does seem quite spontaneously, began staging regular protests and holding 15 minutes of silence in public places, including particularly intersections, so they would block roads. And they had a number of demands, which included the release of the full release of documents indicating whose responsibility it was that this section of the station was what wasn't up to scratch, as it were. They have the students very much rejected attempts by established pro-Western political parties in Serbia to kind of glom onto them, and there are some rather amusing images of party leaders being escorted away from the protests. Now, it does. I think that at least initially, some Western powers, and I would suspect that Britain's probably at the forefront of this, saw this as an opportunity to mess with the government. Because, as you mentioned, the government is pro-Western, but it also enjoys relationships with Russia and China that the EU and Britain are not very happy about. I might add that in the wake of the Crocus Hall shooting in Moscow last year, Vucic made a statement which said that there is one power that does things like this, and it's not the US. And I think that he was referring to Britain, which is a pretty bold statement to make. So yeah, I think the problem from the West's perspective was that the students were very, very keen to not be affiliated with Western NGOs, pro-Western opposition elements, and also at their EU and NATO flags and signs in English were banned. Now, just because they reject Western sponsorship doesn't mean that the West didn't see this as as something to glom onto and exploit. Now, what I thought was quite interesting was there was a distinct lack of Western media coverage of these protests compared to the blanket reporting on the NED, USAID, British, German sponsored unrest in Georgia, for example. And I saw I think it was an Atlantic Council apparatchik who was complaining about the lack of coverage that the protests in Serbia were garnering in the media. Which the answer to that, of course, being that, well, they're actually not behind this and controlling it, and they don't have assets on the ground who can feed them all sorts of content that can be blasted out via the mainstream media. However, on last Saturday, there was a huge number of people entered Belgrade in order to stage a protest. But and there are these various kind of aerial shots of vast crowds in the center of Belgrade. They didn't really seem to have any real objective apart from just attending. They weren't calling for the overthrow of the government. They were rejecting, any and all forms of violence. They were just kind of turning out in very large numbers. And I might add that there were some elements of the students who made enormous claims about what these protests would achieve. And there was this one was quoted in Deutsche Welle, which is the German state broadcaster, that, well, this is going to be D-Day and Serbia will never be the same again. But in reality, despite the sizable crowds, and I've seen some people estimate there was 1.2 million people there, which would be around the sixth of Serbia's population, which is to say that's total rubbish. Once it became clear that there was going to be that nothing was really going to happen. The police were extremely light-handed and were very, very careful to avoid incitement. There was some scumbag who ran over a couple of protesters in their car. They were very promptly arrested, and the authorities were doing everything they could to ensure that things remained peaceful and calm. Everyone disappeared very, very, very quickly. I was kind of dipping in and out on what was happening via live feeds of Belgrade CCTV, and there was almost a kind of blink and you'd miss it moment where everyone just kind of decided to go home, and then the streets are completely empty. Now, on the subject of attempting to exploit what happened, in the wake of this, the Western media has taken a outsized interest in claims that an audio cannon was used at the protests. Now, this is, I mean, I've not seen anything approaching serious evidence that that one was used. I mean, I've been on the subject. I've been been on in protests in the UK where including Occupy, where LRADs were deployed. There was a moment during a 15 minutes of silence where there was one video out of the great many that were taken of this portion of the protest. There was just one in which you can hear a kind of roaring sound that does sound like a jet, but yeah, it doesn't it doesn't seem particularly realistic, given that authorities were committed to ensuring that things remain peaceful in the day, that they would, for no apparent reason, deploy an audio cannon during during a portion of the protest where an enormous number of people were filming things on their phones in an area which is heavily covered by CCTV anyway. And then, so in the wake of this, and I mean, you have up on screen now that PSG, which is this pro-EU opposition party, there was an audio recording of a secret meeting they held where they were openly talking about attacking the Serbian parliament and trying to occupy it, and also the offices of RTS, which is a state broadcaster. And the students were very quick to distance themselves from PSG as a result of this. The sudden flurry of mainstream interest in the apparent use of this audio cannon suggests to me that this could well have been outside actors responsible, and that this is how the this was a means of Western powers exploiting the protests for their own purposes. As I say, the media coverage of events was pretty limited. It's only now that suddenly that the BBC, and I also noticed outlets in Australia, are covering this story about this alleged sonic weapon that was used. So, I mean, it's all I would say it's certainly not a Western-sponsored color revolution attempt in the classic sense, although the way this is being framed and the sudden surge of interest is certainly rather suspicious in the wake of them. I mean, the city is very peaceful and calm now. There is some talk of future protests, although I mean it's all a bit abstract at the moment. And I think that actually, funnily enough, the fact that what the protest amounted to was a large number of people attending a very specific place and then dispersing when nothing really happened. It is a demonstration of what Dominic Lacerdo writes about in his book, The Myth of Nonviolence, where he talks about how, well, because of the promotion of US-sponsored color revolutions as being won purely by peaceful protesters turning up in profusion, and then governments being toppled that way, when in reality the Western-sponsored student groups at the forefront of color revolutions are just the public face of machinations that are going on behind the scenes, courtesy of the CIA, NED, and USAID. There is is this myth that's been created that simply by, yes, congregating in vast numbers in outside government buildings, you can bring down governments.
Hmm.
But the students themselves were not calling for the overthrow of Vucic. They were just calling for better governance
Hmm.
from their perspective. So yeah, I mean, it didn't really it was somewhat anticlimactic, I think, for a lot of people. And there is now this kind of post hoc attempt to raise questions about police abuses, which is, yes, rather suspicious.
Hmm. Well, I think it's probably a desperate attempt to make it into something that it wasn't, which
Mm,
is that the various different attempts to sort of further destabilize Serbia and bring it firmly into the US British column haven't worked thus far. And as the war in Ukraine starts to become more and more obviously a disaster, it is less and less likely that these sort of pro-Western color revolution operations will succeed. And just to dive further into a point you were making there, like it's not just in the east of Europe that these ludicrous ideas about like if you just get enough people to turn up and walk around a government
mm,
building that something will change. This was the point of view of the anti-war movement in Britain 20 years ago. Like
mm,
this was it. It was like if we get enough people, we will win by moral force, which of course is a complete misinterpretation of like the way in which actually existing socialism collapsed under the weight of a counter-revolution in 1989 to 1991, which is that what happened there was that the Velvet Revolution, so called, was the public face, as you said, and in places like Romania, the dirty work was done by defectors from the army, fascist groups, CIA men, essentially manipulating the situation and providing the armed wing of this. The Soviet Union was collapsed by people defecting from within the power structure, basically. You try and do that in Britain 20 years ago, try and bring your moral force to London, they'll say, that's nice, go home.
mm,
Which is what it was. So without the, should we say, the heavy mob behind you, and without like all the other elements that go into color revolutions, which
mm,
include, covert assassinations, sniper squads, fascist elements being the strong arm men, then your color revolution doesn't have anything. And so what it seems to me that is happening in Serbia is that there is a fair amount of generalized discontent, but due to the discrediting of the US, the British, and to a certain extent the EU as well, those options in terms of pursuing the line that would lead Serbia closer to those institutions, to those countries, is not a popular one. And so the
mm,
discontent is sort of seems to be stuck in a cycle, essentially, where they know what they're against, but they don't know what they're for, and hence why the
mm.
protests seem rather unconvincing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also might add as well that, like, I think that we may well have discussed on the show before that that Serbia was basically ground zero for color revolutions when they
Mm.
in October 2000 the NED, US aid, and the CIA overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in what's known as the bulldozer revolution. What came afterwards was economic shock therapy, the destruction of its worker-owned and kind of mixed market economy, which brought misery to an enormous number of people. Funnily enough, the it's called the bulldozer revolution because there are these very famous pictures of a wheel loader which was used to shield protesters from police and help protesters get into government buildings. The guy, ironically enough, the guy who drove it, he ran under Milosevic. He ran a very successful independent business. Once Milosevic was gone, he went bankrupt and he lived out the rest of his days on meager state welfare payments. So, be careful what you wish for. But I think that the experience of having, yes, being this kind of laboratory testing ground for color revolutions means that while people do want change, they don't want a total upturning of the system. because they know that the results are likely to be considerably worse. Particularly, it's if it's done in the interests of Western powers. So, I mean, I mentioned that the EU and NATO flags were banned from these protests. A large number of people had Russian flags.
Mm.
A large number of people had signs calling for a rejection of the EU and greater integration in BRICS,
Hmm.
and a deepening of ties with China. So, from the West perspective, that's very, very problematic, and it does kind of tend to reinforce my interpretation that it's now that Western powers see some kind of a means of exploiting these protests for their own interests, even though they were explicitly the intent of the protesters was explicitly anti-Western,
Mm.
and so yeah, I think that the wider point to make is that we have growing anti-war sentiment across anti-war, anti-sanctions, indeed anti-NATO sentiment growing across Europe, and Serbia throughout the conflict has remained neutral, refused to sanction Russia despite enormous pressure and threats being brought to bear on the government to fall in line. Hilariously, there have been numerous calls from EU apparatchiks and people working for Western-funded NGOs in Serbia itself to sanction Serbia or indeed cancel its EU membership path, which nobody wants anyway.
Mm.
So it's like people laugh at this, and also because they see the penalties for stepping a foot out of line and how they are treated as colonial curs, as it were. It just pushes them further and further away from anything like pro-Western sentiment.
Mm.
And so, I mean, there is as again we've discussed before, throughout this region there is a growing state level pushback. I mean, the Serbia's neighboring countries, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia is not far away. Macedonia recently re-elected a VMRO, which is historically a kind of nationalist pro-Eastern party into government. Again, the West seems to have painted itself into a corner where it's like, well, they're all out of honey and all they have to offer is vinegar. But if they, as in Georgia, if they start trying to penalize leaders who don't play ball and twist their arms aggressively, it just pushes governments and indeed populations further eastwards.
Mm.
I mean, in Georgia, as I mentioned, like that is attempting to turn Georgia into the perfect puppet state is a story that has played out for 35 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. There was sizable public support for joining the EU, NATO slightly less so, but all of the attacks on their government, which included an EU commissioner openly threatening the elected Georgian Dream government with the same fate as Robert Fico, who was
Mm.
shot in very suspicious circumstances by a Ukrainian ultra for his anti-war, anti-sanctions, anti-NATO platform. That's undone. All of those machinations and threats and the sanctioning of government officials has undone 35 years of work
Mhm.
in turning Georgia into this perfect puppet client state. So, I think that I mentioned neighboring Romania. We've just seen Calin Georgescu, who can lay some claim to being the rightful president of Romania, who was well on course to winning last year's presidential election before Romania's constitutional court overturned the results due to false claims of Russian meddling. He's now been banned from standing, which caused mass protests, and another candidate who attempted to run was explicitly blocked by Romania's constitutional court due to her quote unquote anti-NATO positions. So I mean, I think that we're probably going to see a lot more of that. But then the immediate upshot is it's just going to foment yet further anti-NATO sentiment.
Yeah. Well, this is the point where like the absolute emptiness of so-called democracy in many countries becomes obvious. I mean, and not just in the East either. Like in Britain, I mean, we've talked about this before, and I've talked about it on my own streams. They get the entire political establishment to line up behind like a pro-NATO position over Ukraine. Everybody lines up behind Keir Starmer. Everybody from the Labour left through to Nigel Farage, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, etc., all backing up Starmer's line. And all that does really is it discredits all of them in the eyes of any thinking person. Because what's clear is that as Starmer himself blurted out in a weird way, he's got this strange way that he's very proud of like being a state bureaucrat. He's very proud that he stands for a regime that literally cannot and will not allow discussion of certain things. Where he said, "Oh, I am as one with Rishi Sunak on matters of security." This is him like obeying his masters because of the small deviations that Jeremy Corbyn engaged in were terrifying to the securocrats who Starmer works for. And so he's open about the fact that there's certain things cannot be discussed. NATO cannot be discussed. The Ukraine war cannot be discussed. They're trying to clamp down on the Palestinian solidarity movement, but that's not working very well for a variety of historical reasons, which we probably don't have time to go into now. But it is the case that there is so much now which is done by elite uniformity. But the more the elite unify and the more despised they become, because the conditions of life continue to deteriorate for people in old perfidious Albion, the more that the political establishment parties become discredited, the more the system becomes discredited. And then their only response is more repression. And so, like, Romania is further down the road slightly than we are, but we've already had council elections cancelled this year. I think precisely because it would deliver like a random set of results that the political establishment doesn't want to see. So they've been postponed because reasons, you know. So this is going to be this is going to get ever more noticeable. So at the moment, this is like they're clamping down on like right wingers, like petty bourgeois nationalists, etc. But they're just the first wave of discontent. Like as things intensify, you're going to get this happening in France, which is there. If Mélenchon or people aligned with him were to win bigger positions or to come close to the French presidency, my instinct is that they would either rig it or find some way of barring him from entry to it on the grounds that, because NATO, etc., or you are questioning things that cannot be questioned. And I'm glad this is happening in many ways because it reveals that there's now going to be a list so long of things that nobody's allowed to question. And if they come out into the open and say this, that's good because it's actually spelling out the reality of the utter hollowness of this so-called democracy that the capitalist class actually offer in the imperial core and in the periphery now, which is that this is what it always was. It's a choice of who implements a policy which was decided in a closed, smoky room anyway, where nobody in that place is subject to any democratic constraint, and then the verdict is delivered to a puppet in Downing Street who then reads it out off an auto cue. And that's your democracy in Britain, in the United States, in France, or in Romania. And this is what they're offering. And the more people understand that, the better things will be. Did you have anything else to add, Kit?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I just think that we are facing, just across the Western world, like this absolute crisis of quote unquote democracy. I mean, I don't think this is at all new. I just think it's just gotten to the point where the Western elites know that they can just get away with anything. I mean, we've seen this in France where a left coalition won fair and square. Macron has engaged in all sorts of skullduggery to prevent them from taking power, including consulting with Marine Le Pen,
Hmm.
and all this other stuff. I mean, in Germany, the Sarah Wagenknecht's a kind of breakaway party. There was very legitimate and very credible evidence to suggest that the results were deliberately fudged to prevent her party from entering parliament. And you have Die Linke, which its star had been falling. Suddenly, its vote share exploded, and it, like all other mainstream German political parties, with the apparent exception of AfD, although whether they would fall into line a la Farage,
Hmm.
Agent Farage, on Ukraine if they actually got into power, I mean, that's an open question. But it's like, yeah, I mean, Die Linke's all in on this. There is no serious opposition, and if there is serious opposition, they will find, whether overtly or covertly, some way to crush it. I mean, on so many issues, democratically elected governments, allegedly, are completely out of step with public opinion, but also feel absolutely no compulsion whatsoever to even pretend to reflect public interest, public wishes,
Hmm.
public wills at all. And I mean, we mentioned Starmer's, collapsing polling ratings. He came in to replace the least popular government and least popular prime minister in history. He is carrying out all of the same, to the extent that Labour at all on the campaign trail attempted to differentiate themselves from the Conservatives, and now just doing all of the same thing.
Hmm.
And if you look at polls, that the level of public discontent, and also like levels of public distrust in the system, are at like absolute record highs. But that doesn't seem to be translating into much in the way of action.
Hmm.
I mean, you mentioned the cancellation of the local elections. I've seen like virtually zero pushback against that at all.
No,
So, I mean,
because
what? Sorry, go
well,
ahead.
because nobody gives a shit. Because the
Yeah.
local councils have limited powers, and no one votes in those fucking things anyway, or very few
Mm,
people do. And the population understands, or at least I think the working class population understands on some level, that it doesn't matter who you vote for. Now, I think the reason why it was cancelled was probably so you didn't end up with like a reform landslide, because
mm,
that's not in the particular ruling class agenda at the moment. They're being held in reserve to do something in the future, and it would further the narrative that the government was in crisis, which I don't think that they want to happen at the moment. I think they want Labour to serve the full 5 years and do a lot of the dirty work. Then a revived right-wing party can come in and take things further. I think that's the plan. And it's the reason why, like, for instance, to get to draw on the Farage story. Now, there's an unbearable bourgeois hack who you may be familiar with called Michael Crick in this country,
mm.
who is an
Yes.
unbearable bourgeois hack, but he did write an interesting, well, a somewhat interesting biography of Farage, where he made an interesting observation that every time Farage faces a challenge for the leadership or the premier position, either in UKIP or the Brexit Party or Reform, his challenger usually ends up having a hit job done on them in the press very quickly. So this happened to, of all people, a man you might remember as well as I do from childhood, a certain Robert Kilroy Silk, 20 years
Mm.
ago, who, if you don't know, dear viewers, Robert Kilroy Silk was an ex-Labour MP who became a chat show host, who became sort of a sort of golf club right-wing bilious moron, who made big speeches and got in to UKIP and then was going to become the leader of UKIP. Then suddenly support got pulled. The money men threatened to pull their support from the party if he went any further, and he disappeared. Same was true for this guy, Rupert Lowe, who actually took the platform of reform seriously and started making big speeches about deporting people en masse. Ruling class don't actually want that. So suddenly allegations were made, negative press stories run. He was chucked out of the party. He won't be an MP before too long. And I think what it reveals is that Farage whether he's on a contract of employment or not, I don't think he is. He's a member of the club, fundamentally. And if you're a member of the club, you, like in the manner of all British clubs, like you understand the rules, even if you don't have to have them presented to you. And the rules for a guy like Farage are you get to occupy a lane, you get to bring dissent towards you, you get to make a big noise, go on TV a lot, but you don't get to actually upset things too much. And so when the time comes, Nigel dutifully steps back, and the movements that he has led basically crumbled and fall to pieces. Like he stepped away from UKIP immediately after the Brexit referendum. UKIP crumbled into dust. Um, he's come back. He was brought back with reform in order to basically make sure the Tories lost in a big way. That's been done, and now what will probably happen is they'll probably push reform to sort of merge with the Tories under a new Tory leader, and the dissent that went into reform will be carefully marshaled back in towards establishment, firmly controlled parties again. So this is Nigel's job, and he's been very successful at it for 30 years. So always bear in mind that what you're looking at when the BBC puts a guy on TV and tells you this guy is dangerous, this guy is a dissenter, it's almost a racing certainty that he's not dangerous and that he's not a dissenter. Because if he was, then the BBC wouldn't be putting him on Newsnight and wouldn't be putting him on Question Time. He would be relegated to the fringes if he was actually dangerous. So this is the state of like the very controlled world of British bourgeois politics, which is that they will give you a numerous fake alternatives for you to engage with. But the people who run these alternatives understand their job very well, and it is to basically lead you down a blind alley and leave you there, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most, I didn't quite have the kind of vocab or underlying um, uh, framework to articulate this properly at the time. But like, I mean, if you go back to say like the period between the 2010 and the 2015 general election, when there was an enormous amount of dissent and anger at what the coalition government was doing, which was pure evil with austerity. And the Labour Party, after initial tepid efforts to push back against this narrative that Labour spending on disability benefits was what caused the financial crisis, it's all because we spent all this money we didn't have, blah blah. That was a period that was ripe for the emergence of a left-wing alternative to Labour. And then what actually happened was that Nigel Farage became a basically weekly fixture on Question Time, and UKIP was promoted as the anti-establishment outsider, and a bit dangerous and a threat to the establishment when it was just Thatcherism again.
Yes.
And so this was the British state broadcaster telling you Nigel Farage is the voice of the working class. It's rather forgotten that UKIP performed astonishingly well in the 2015 election. They came second in an enormous number of constituencies due to first past the post. They didn't, get anywhere near having a single seat, of course, but it was a very effective it was a very effective means of trapping dissent into a cul-de-sac. I remember that there was a poll in the lead up to the 2015 election, which showed that UKIP voters overwhelmingly didn't care about the EU. It was like their top 5 issues were stuff like healthcare, crime, schools, blah blah, all kind of very legitimate concerns, which an actual left-wing political party would address. But this was framed in the liberal media as like, oh, all these UKIP supporters, they're so stupid. They're backing this anti-EU party when they don't even care about the EU. That was the framing. And it's very, very interesting that Nigel Farage does seem to have this habit of surfacing at useful moments from the perspective of the British establishment and then disappearing again, and that before resurfacing. Norman Tebbit well-known left-wing firebrand, close associate of Margaret Thatcher. He actually wrote an article many, many years ago. I believe it was for the Spectator. I think it was in the late 90s, where he claimed that he'd been told by sources within the intelligence services that UKIP was being run by MI5
Mm.
as a means of neutralizing the Tories, because the ruling elites were rather happy with trigger happy war hungry Blair
Mm.
being in Downing Street, and they didn't want the Conservatives to mess with that in any way. So I mean, make of that what you will, but it's yeah, I mean that's certainly something to get into in a future episode.
Well, yes, and I think we'll conclude today by just saying that um, the 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 ruling class of bold perfidious Albion have had a long tradition and have long practiced in making these fake alternatives to people and these fake avenues for dissent and channeling
Mm,
dissent in reactionary directions. So, like you said, like there, quite correctly, like the working class voters for UKIP and the working class voters for Reform, like their top concerns will be like, well, employment, paying conditions, healthcare, education, the usual things that people are concerned about. And what the British ruling class have done via their propaganda operation over the last few years is to push is to racialize or attempt to racialize all of those concerns, put it all onto immigration, and therefore to then present the solution to that being reform, a vote for reform, whilst they basically make sure that like the working class dissident voters go to reform. They then use the time to essentially further their agenda via the Labour Party, via Keir Starmer, Wes Streeting. They use that time to reassemble the Conservative Party in a more convincing way under perhaps a more convincing leader. They will then pull Farage, say, right, Nigel, time to go back to the golf club. That reform will deflate, and they hope the votes will go back to the Tories again. So it's a very careful game of management that's been played by the British intelligence and political and intellectual establishment since 2008, really, knowing they're on very fragile ground. Managing to manipulate the situation just the right way is a very difficult job, but this is because like the entire left media plays the game of saying, "Oh my God, UKIP slash Reform, dangerous fascist." It's like, well, you're helping the narrative. The narrative to actually destroy Farage is to reveal him as the servant of the state, which he actually is, not call him the dangerous coming of the Fourth Reich or something, because that actually adds to his sort of outsider kudos that people are attracted to. But I think this probably brings us to the end of the discussion for this week. We'll be back again next week. I would urge everybody to check out the Substack page, which is now up and running and will include audio versions of all of the shows that we've done since November of last year. And also be sure to check out and subscribe to the YouTube page, which is where this show will be hosted from now on. And a Rumble account to follow, because you never know when MI5 is going to flick the off switch on particular internet services. So check all that out and join us again for the show next week. Kit, any final words for the good people?
Well, no, thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, I mean, it's we are yeah, going to be running this as a kind of independent operation from now on. You can, yeah, find us on Substack. We will be launching a Twitter account. We have our own dedicated YouTube now. I would urge you to check out our past episodes, which will be uploaded there. They are timeless.
Mm.
In fact, probably gain in relevance as time goes on, if I dare say so myself. So yeah, no, it's been despite the oft depressing subject matter, it's been a blast, and thanks as always for joining us. See you next week.
See you next week, everybody.